I'm Sue Hibbert. I'm a watercolour painter and I'm from Perth. I started painting from a very early age. My father was an artist and so I grew up in a very creative environment. I started in fashion design and I really enjoyed the creativity in that, illustrating mostly, coming up with ideas, and I always intended at some stage painting. And I think because I'd used watercolours and ink, I was familiar with that. And then I just continued exploring and doing life drawing and taking different classes and just trying to explore what sort of art I wanted to produce. I started painting landscapes after I had a trip with my family. We travelled around Australia and I hadn't seen Western Australia and the Northern Territory and that area, and it's such a beautiful landscape and the colours, the textures, and I was just really taken with that. So that I really mostly painted landscapes to start off with for several years, and then after a trip overseas, I then was wanting to paint buildings and texture, and so I moved into that sort of area. So I tend to, wherever I've been, I'm always looking and collecting potential subjects for painting, and I do very much move from one to another. Yeah, it was landscapes, buildings. More recently, my paintings have been about interiors. I really enjoy capturing light, so it's very much about the dynamic light that you get through windows. Like I've painted several old backyard sheds and workspaces as well, and it is about the light streaming through windows. You've got dark areas within that space, so you can see in there but you can't. So I find that a really interesting way of painting as well, using different techniques that happen naturally in watercolours. So having areas that are only just very suggested with working wet into wet, and then bringing out a little bit of detail as I go along. So very much in the painting, it develops through the process, and then I often discover the painting through the process, and I like to be able to have that relationship while I'm working. Creativity for me is yes, having the freedom to express through artwork, just your ideas, and also setting the time aside and having a day or an afternoon that's just your painting time, your creative time. I think creativity is a quiet space. I don't think a lot while I'm painting. I just, have a few little words of, might be colour, a bit more blue or whatever, so there's very little thought. I think it's a nice connection, and I think that's what becomes quite peaceful. But I think it's a matter of a practice of looking, always being aware, taking photographs if that helps you to get an idea, or keeping a journal of ideas I think is really good. So you're jotting down thoughts. It might be something you've read, so you'll write that down, or something you've seen, and so you keep a little bit of a journal of ideas. The art of seeing, and that's the beauty of painting, is that it just tunes you into really looking around at what's around you. So often it's the smallest thing that we walk past that you don't really notice, and yet there's so much intrigue and interest. I do get a lot of students in my class that will actually say, once they start painting, after a few weeks they'll come in and say, oh, I was looking at the texture of these trees, when I was going for my walk, and it was just amazing, the amount of colour and texture and shape that I'm more aware of. And I think it's those things that's what it does, and it just gives us a lot of, I think, enjoyment in life, that we can appreciate those small things, and that's what art does. It gets us to slow down and really look. I guess for me, inspiration is wherever you go. I think just every day. Walking down the street, you go into a shop, and when you start really looking, I've done that. I did a series of paintings on shopping centres. So somewhere where we're always walking around and through, and I was just really interested, okay, so if I had to paint this, what is it about this environment that's unique, different? How do I feel in this environment? I mostly work from photographs, and then once I have those, I can then work out composition, how I'm going to change that photograph, and again, what was the mood and the feel, I think is really important. It's something we often forget. And how can you represent that in your painting? And often it's working with a particular colour palette. It might be, as I said, working with brush marks, so it might be using a different mark making technique to show that. And maybe it's not about detail, it's about soft edges and working wet into wet. So it really depends on the feel that you're wanting to get in your painting. I found plein air painting really useful, and just painting outdoors. With plein air painting, often I do the sketching as well. So I have a sketchbook, which I've used travelling. Often you can't take a lot of equipment with you, so just having a small A5 sketchbook I found really useful, a small watercolour palette, and keeping things very minimal. So being in a cafe, I've really enjoyed just sitting in a cafe and sketching people around me, and just the space, and using recently a more tonal palette. I've got not too many colours, and I find that really useful because it's just observing, just looking every day, and they're enjoyable. So a lot of those will then move into a painting as well. I could use that as a bit of a reference, and of course I'll take photos of that space and then later develop that up into a full larger watercolour. With watercolours, I find you need to reserve the white paper, and so that's always really important. So I generally plan a painting using a thumbnail sketch, and it is something that artists have been using for a very long time. But it's very useful because then I can work out where to keep my lights, where my dark values are. So tonally, it's really important to know, even though I'm using colour, I need to know what's happening with the tone. And also to work out my composition. I think composition is very important. So yeah, just understanding focal points. There's a whole lot of things that are necessary to resolve up front. And then once I've worked that out and I've worked out my colours, I usually pre-mix my paint. So when I actually start painting, a lot of thinking has already happened up front. I do like to visualise a painting in my mind before I even start. So I do carry a painting in my mind for a while. And I find if I can think it through and I understand my subject, and then I understand the mood, the feel, what's important, how I'll approach it with my brush marks. I just like to build a little bit of a story up in my mind first. So when I actually start painting, I feel like I can then react to what's happening on the surface of the paper. And then I can allow some of that, the things that naturally occur in watercolours, I can have that dialogue with the medium. I think it's really important in a painting to not over-control it. And I have to be aware while I'm painting. If I find I'm over-controlling it and I'm a bit apprehensive, then I lose the possibility of getting some really beautiful, expressive passages in my painting. And often it is taking a chance, because when you start a painting, often we think, okay, I want this to work. So you have a predetermined idea on how it's going to be. And of course that then restricts your freedom and your enjoyment of the painting, because you've already set it up that you want the painting to work. So I find if I approach it with just being in the moment, enjoying the painting and the mark making at that moment, and not think, because I've already thought about what it's going to look like, but while I'm painting I'm not thinking of the end result. And then I can allow some really nice effects to happen in the painting. And then through that process, I find if I use big brushes, I get the big areas in. I'm aware I'm looking at the whole painting at the one time, not allowing myself to focus in on any detail too early. I think that's a big thing, not focusing on detail too early. Big brushes, move down to, middle-sized brushes, a small brush right at the end, and then you can judge where to put the detail in far better if you leave it towards the end of the painting. And then you can, it's like the little tweaking, and then you've got a better balance in the overall composition. When I start painting, as I don't think a lot about the painting, I don't think a lot. I'm just really reacting to what's happening on the paper. So I think that process actually works a lot better. If your mind is full of other things, you haven't given it your full attention. And I think watercolour demands your full attention, because it's a quick medium. And usually I start and finish a painting in the one session. I never stop a painting halfway, because I find the following day, or whenever I can get to finish it, I'm going to have a very different mark on the paper, and it doesn't have that same rhythm or the same flow that I would have built up through the process. So for me, I've got to start and finish it. And when I finish a painting, I very rarely go back and do anything to it. I like the idea of having areas that are slightly not resolved. So it's a little balance of sharp detail and areas that just suggest something. I think it actually engages the viewer more into the painting, because then they've got to work things out. So I'm just sort of suggesting what's happening in there, and it's interesting what a couple little marks can suggest. I think the creative process, often we go through stages where we have a lot of ideas, and then you're on a bit of a roll with your painting and your creativity, and then we go through, it's almost like a peaks and troughs. And I think that's a very natural process with anything that's creative. You can't be constantly at your best. And during those times, I've found when you're in a little bit of a trough and you're kind of not as happy with your work, maybe you've had a successful painting and you think, oh great, I've learned something new. And then like I've reached that next level. And then so what happens is the next painting you do, often you load it with an expectation that this one's going to be as good as the one that you're really happy with. And because you've already put an expectation on that painting, often it doesn't work because you're not as relaxed while you're in that process. So I think it's really good during those times when you're not as happy with your work, just to do some research. I think just get inspired, look at other artists' work that you really love or you'd like to paint in a similar style, whether it's subject matter or mark making or technique. So then it's a really good opportunity to experiment and just extend what you're already doing, and then you put yourself into that play mode. And I think it's really important. As adults we think, oh, you know, whatever we're doing, it's got to be serious, but you've really got to allow yourself to just play and see what comes off the effects that you're getting, and often you can then use that in your work sometime down the track. when you are starting out, especially in a new medium as well, it's important, especially if you have a connection, you really enjoy the medium. I think you've got to enjoy the materials that you're working with. Like I love the paper, you know, you get the feel of the paper, you've got the colours, the actual paint, how the paint mixes in together. So all of that really, you're starting in a really good place because you want to do the painting. We get inspired by looking at other artists' work, and like all artists, that's really important that you do that. But ultimately, you can read a lot of books, you can watch a lot of YouTube now, there's so much that you can see, but it's really what you do. It's a painting time, and just painting as much as you can, and trying and accepting that there's going to be a very large percentage of your work that you will not be happy with, and we are always our own toughest critic, and that's how it is. But just accepting that the paintings that don't work, they're the ones that you learn the most from. I've discovered that is so important, and so you've got to, and just mileage, painting, you know, finding opportunities to paint, going out sketching, and also looking at your work and just doing a self-critique is really important every now and then. I would often put up all my paintings and have a look and see what was working, which areas I felt like I was improving on, and then which areas it might be subject, it might be composition, it could be use of the medium, maybe it was over-controlling things a little bit too much, and then I would be very systematic. I would write down, give myself some key points on what I need to do, where I need to improve it, what subject maybe to paint a little bit more of. And yeah, and then I had a little bit of a path to follow. With creativity, there's a train of thought, and when we have to stop what we're doing, you cut into that train of thought. So it's always really important, I think, when you stop painting, to leave yourself in a place where it's going to be easier to pick up next time when you can. So I think having a journal, jotting down a few ideas, leaving something out. I always suggest to my students that they have like a storyboard of photographs and ideas that they keep up. I think it's really important to paint for yourself. So whatever subject you find interesting, you've got to almost, they say, the selfish artist, which it isn't really, but you do have to explore that idea. Those ideas that you have, you've got to trust them, because there's a reason why you've thought about it, and there's a reason why you find that interesting. So then you've got to just take that up and just see where it takes you, because often they're the ideas that are very, very different, and you'll find you'll gain a lot out of those.